The ground in the lower field had been wet since September. Not from rain, there hadn't been enough of it. The soil just held moisture the way it sometimes did, the way Eli Hargrove's grandfather had told him it would, in that particular hollow where the old creek used to run before it shifted sometime around 1962. Most people would walk that field and see nothing, just damp earth. Maybe think the drainage was slow. Eli saw a message. He was 16, and the farm was his. Not in the legal sense, not yet. There were papers being processed, a court involved, the slow machinery of an estate settling itself out. His father had died 2 winters ago. A tractor accident, quiet and terrible the way those things always are. And he had left Eli the land, the equipment, the debt, and the understanding that the ground beneath your feet was the only thing that stayed. The Hargrove farm had been in the family for 3 generations, and now it fell to Eli to carry it forward. His grandfather, still alive at 78, drove out from town twice a week to help. But the farm was Eli's. Everybody in the county knew it. He had been reading that land since he could walk. Not the way you read a textbook, linearly, with conclusions already arranged. He read it the way you read weather, continuously, skeptically, with memory. He had a notebook, spiral-bound, stuffed behind the seat of the farm truck. In it, hand-drawn maps of drainage paths, water table notes dated back 3 years. Records of where the cattle refused to drink after storms and where the barn swallows built their nests lower than usual. Soil descriptions with sketches of color gradients. The pale gray that appeared after a dry summer, the dark rust band that showed up 18 inches down only on the east side of the second pasture. His grandfather had a name for what Eli was doing. He called it paying attention. The soil is the great connector of lives, the old man used to say, quoting someone. Eli never knew who. It links the dead, the living, and the ones not yet born. That fall, the swallows left early. 6 weeks before the first frost, Eli had been watching that species for years. They nested lower when the water table was rising, not a theory. Just something he'd confirmed season after season, checking nest heights against his water table records. That October, every nest on the south fence line was less than 4 feet off the ground. He wrote it down. The creek behind the south fence ran slower than any October he could remember. The color of the water just slightly off. Not polluted, just different, with a faint mineral trace along the stones. And just across the fence line, on the edge of the land that would soon belong to someone else, the grass had stopped growing in a 30-foot circle. Dead, brown, dry at the center even when everything around it was wet. He didn't own that land, but he could see it from his fence. He pressed his fingers into the soil on his own side of the boundary and noticed how the ground felt different near that circle. Almost hollow underfoot, as though something was wrong in the substrate below the surface. He didn't tell anyone yet, he just wrote it down. That was November. By February, the surveyors arrived. If you grew up around farmland, rivers, hard work, or people who understood the land better than any textbook ever could, subscribe and stay a while. These are the stories that deserve to be told. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. The company was called Crestfield Energy Group. Not a household name, but not a small operation either. They had purchased 8,000 acres of land bordering the Hargrove farm and 3 other property farms along the Sulphur Creek corridor, a wide, shallow river valley where the geology was promising and the land was cheap. They arrived professionally. Clean trucks, polished boots. Engineers with tablets and drone equipment and satellite survey data going back 15 years. They set up a temporary office in a converted construction trailer at the edge of the county road, and they were, by every observable measure, organized. The lead project engineer was a man named Whitfield. Mid-40s, confident, the kind of calm that comes from having solved difficult problems in difficult places. He had worked oil fields in 3 countries. He understood subsurface geology the way surgeons understand the body, in systems, in data, in procedures. He had read his company's geological report on the Crestfield acreage. It was 214 pages long. It drew on soil core samples, seismic imaging, and comparative data from similar formations 200 miles east. What it did not include was a conversation with anyone who had actually farmed this ground. Eli met Whitfield at the fence line in early March. He'd ridden the property line on his quad and stopped when he saw the survey stakes going in. Small orange flags, spaced 50 feet apart, marching across the hollow where the old creek used to run. "Those stakes are going through the lower run," Eli said. Whitfield looked up. He smiled, the way professionals smile at young people who have useful intentions but no relevant expertise. "We're following the survey corridor," Whitfield said. "Came back clean." "That ground's been saturated since September," Eli said. "It's not surface water, it's coming up from below. The old creek channel runs under that whole section. It shifted above ground decades ago, but the underground path is still active." Whitfield paused, tablet in one hand. "Where are you getting that from?" "From watching it." Another pause, shorter this time. "We appreciate that," Whitfield said carefully. "But our subsurface imaging didn't indicate a significant aquifer event in that section. There's some moisture retention, but it's within normal parameters for this soil type." Eli looked at the orange flags. "The stakes through the hollow are going to give you trouble," he said. "We'll keep an eye on it," Whitfield said. That was a Tuesday. By the following Monday, the heavy equipment had begun moving in. Understand what Crestfield was building. This wasn't a simple wellhead operation. The plan was a multi-stage infrastructure project. 3 extraction wells along the eastern ridge, a pipeline corridor running southwest toward a processing facility 8 miles out, and a retention pond designed to hold produced water, the saline byproduct of oil extraction, situated in the center of the planned corridor. That retention pond was to be built directly over the hollow, the same hollow with the 30-foot dead grass circle, the same ground that had been wet since September, the same ancient underground creek channel Eli had been watching from his fence line for years. Groundwater systems are not simple. Most people imagine aquifers like underground lakes, still contained, clearly mapped. In reality, shallow aquifers move. They followed buried channels, fracture lines, and gradients of permeability. They respond to pressure changes. They connect to surface features in ways that even sophisticated imaging sometimes misses, because imaging reads density, not history. The history of this particular stretch of land was written in layers of clay, gravel, and old-growth silt going back 10,000 years, to when glacial melt first carved this valley. The underground channel Eli had identified wasn't on any modern geological survey because it had never caused a problem before. It had just quietly carried water, season to season, as it always had. The problem was pressure. When Crestfield's earth movers began compacting the hollow to create a foundation for the retention pond, they unknowingly sealed a section of that underground channel. They didn't block it completely. They just reduced its cross-section, narrowed the path without eliminating it. Water doesn't stop moving when its path narrows. It finds another way. The first sign appeared 6 weeks into construction. A drainage ditch on the Hargrove property, 40 yards north of the construction fence, began running with water it shouldn't have had. February had been dry. March was dry. There was no surface source for the water. Eli walked the ditch. He pressed his fingers into the bank. The water had a faint mineral tang, not from the surface, from below. He tested it with a simple kit his grandfather kept in the barn, the kind used to check livestock water. The mineral content had shifted. He wrote it down. He went back to the fence line and asked to speak with Whitfield again. This time, Whitfield sent a site supervisor named Greer, younger, less patient. "There's water coming up in my north ditch," Eli said. "It started when you began compacting the hollow. The underground channel you didn't survey is being pressurized." Greer looked at the ditch. He looked at the sky, dry, cloudless. "Could be a lot of things," Greer said. "Spring thaw, water table fluctuation." "The mineral content changed," Eli said. "It matches what comes up in the hollow after wet seasons. It's the same water source. We don't have authority to stop operations based on a ditch reading." Eli looked at him steadily. "You've got a retention pond going in above an active underground channel," he said. "When that pond starts filling, the pressure differential is going to push water laterally. It's going to come up where the ground is weakest, and the weakest point is under your access road." Greer thanked him and went back to the site. The access road sank 6 weeks later. It started as a soft spot. Machinery that weighed 40,000 pounds began settling unevenly when it crossed the northwestern section of the access road. Engineers drove stakes. The stakes moved, not from equipment vibration, but from subsurface shift. They brought in additional compaction equipment. They laid crushed stone. The soft spot migrated 20 feet west. Then the retention pond liner began showing stress. A geomembrane liner, the material used to prevent produced water from seeping into surrounding soil, is engineered to handle pressure from above. It is designed assuming the substrate below is stable. When the substrate begins to move laterally, the liner experiences differential stress. Microtears develop along seams. In April, a water quality test from a monitoring well on the Hargrove property came back with elevated conductivity levels. Conductivity is a measure of dissolved minerals, a standard proxy for contamination risk. The number was still within safe limits, but it had risen. Eli's grandfather saw the test report. He drove to the county extension office. He called a lawyer. At the Crestfield site, Whitfield was now managing 3 simultaneous engineering problems: the access road instability, the liner stress, and a drainage pattern that had shifted around the retention pond. Water that should have flowed east was pooling west, pushing toward the property line. An internal engineering review was ordered. A hydrologist was brought in, a woman named Dr. Calloway, contracted from an environmental consulting firm in the city. She spent 2 days on the site and 1 afternoon walking the fence line with her own instruments. On the 3rd morning, she asked to speak with whoever had been reporting the issues. Greer brought her to the fence. Eli was there, his notebook in hand. Dr. Calloway was not dismissive. She looked at Eli's notebook, the dated entries, the hand-drawn maps, the water test records going back years, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. "When did you first notice the moisture anomaly in the hollow?" she asked. "September," Eli said. "But I've got records showing irregular drainage there, going back to when I was 12. It gets worse every 3 or 4 years. Follows the wet cycle." She looked at her tablet. She looked at his notebook. She looked at the hollow. "Your survey missed it because the channel runs north-south through a clay lens," Eli said. "The imaging would have read it as dense subsoil. It looks like a non-permeable layer, but it's actually a confined pathway. It only activates under pressure." Dr. Calloway looked at him. "How do you know what subsurface imaging reads?" "I looked it up," Eli said. After March, she asked for copies of his records. He went home that evening and photocopied every relevant page: the water table logs, the drainage maps, the mineral test results, the swallow nest height records. He kept the originals. He handed her a full copy at the fence the following morning. 3 days later, her report landed on Whitfield's desk. It confirmed a relict stream channel buried beneath a clay layer at approximately 11 feet running north-south through the hollow. The compaction of the retention pond foundation had increased hydraulic pressure in the confined channel, forcing lateral movement toward the lowest surface gradient, which was the Hargrove property's northern fence line, and then the construction access road. The retention pond liner had experienced differential settlement along its western edge. Not catastrophic, but enough to require remediation. The estimated cost of corrective work, over $2 million. The delay to the project timeline, 4 to 6 months. Whitfield read the report twice. Then he asked Greer to set up a meeting. They met at the fence line, same as before. But this time it was different. Whitfield came himself. He brought Dr. Calloway. He brought a copy of her report in his hand. Eli stood on his side of the fence. His grandfather stood beside him, arms crossed, saying nothing. "You identified a buried channel about 4 months before we started work," Whitfield said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Eli said. "And you told Greer about the pressure risk before the access road failed." "Yes." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the fence grass. A swallow cut low across the hollow, the same hollow that had been wet since September, and banked hard south without landing. "I'd like to ask Dr. Calloway's firm to do a full resurvey of the corridor before we do any further construction," Whitfield said. "And I'd like to ask if you'd be willing to walk that corridor with her, to look at what you've observed, informally." Eli glanced at his grandfather. The old man gave him nothing, just watched. "That hollow needs a bypass channel," Eli said. "Not a retention pond. The water has to go somewhere. If you redirect the pond site 50 yards east, you're out of the confined layer entirely." Whitfield turned to Dr. Calloway. She nodded. "That's consistent with what I found." Whitfield looked back at Eli. "We should have listened in March," he said. "It wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't a speech. It was just the truth, said plainly by a man who had built his career on data and models and who was standing at a fence line in the wind, admitting that a 16-year-old with a spiral notebook had understood this land better than his company's 214-page geological report. Eli nodded once. "I can walk it with you Thursday," he said. By summer, the retention pond had been relocated. The access road was rebuilt with a properly designed drainage corridor. The buried creek channel was mapped, documented, and incorporated into the final environmental survey, the first time it had ever officially existed on paper, though it had existed in fact for 10,000 years. The Hargrove farm didn't flood that autumn, as it might have if the original plan had gone forward. The north ditch ran clear again. The cattle drank from it without hesitation. Eli kept his notebook. He started a second one. What this story asks of us is not complicated. It asks us to consider what we mean when we say expertise. We have built institutions, systems, and industries around the idea that knowledge lives in degrees, in reports, in certified processes. And there is real value in all of those things. Whitfield was not a fool. His team was not incompetent. They were working with the best tools available to them. But tools have limits, models have assumptions. Data is always incomplete. What Eli had was something that cannot be modeled from a satellite, years of presence. He had stood in that hollow in every season. He had watched the ground change slowly, in ways that don't show up in a single survey or a week of site assessment. He had learned the land the way his grandfather taught him to learn it, not as a resource to be evaluated, but as a system to be understood. Patient, long, humble. He learned it too because it was his. His father had left it to him, the responsibility and the weight of it, and that changes how a person sees the ground they walk on. You stop being a visitor, you become a custodian. The swallow that cut low across the hollow on the day Whitfield stood at the fence. Eli had been tracking that species for years. He had records of nest heights going back to when he was 12. Low nests meant rising water tables. It was not folklore. It was observation, tested and retested across seasons. It was in the notebook. Nature leaves warnings before it leaves consequences. The land communicates in a language that requires time and attention to learn. And in a world increasingly oriented toward speed, efficiency, and data that can be collected in days, the slow knowledge, the knowledge of seasons, of soil, of what a swallow's nest height means, is increasingly at risk of being lost. It is not anti-progress to say that. It is simply true. The most dangerous gap in modern decision-making is not the gap between intelligence and ignorance. It is the gap between knowing about a thing and knowing a thing, between the report and the field, between the model and the ground. Eli Hargrove understood a buried creek channel that a 214-page document missed, not because he was smarter than the engineers, because he had been paying attention for longer, because the land was his father's before it was his, and he had never been able to afford to stop watching it. That is not a small thing. That is everything.